Now, cast your minds back to that reading we just heard. And remember, I said sometimes when we hear some familiar words, then certain phrases jump out and sort of strike you. And there are 4 phrases when I was reading this passage just this last week, jumped out and struck me. Okay? So I'm just going to share with you what struck me. The first phrase is in verse 1. The women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. The spices they had prepared. So they'd been preparing spices all during the Sabbath. They'd been having wee conversations like, oh, we need to do something. Let's prepare spices. And then when the Sabbath was over, they took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. In 1995, my dad died. And he died suddenly of a heart attack. And it was not long since he and my mum had just moved into a new sheltered housing complex that he died. So as you can imagine, it was really quite a shock. It was a shock to all of us, but it was a shock especially to my mum, because she'd been looking forward to this new phase of life they were going to enjoy together. And suddenly she finds that it's not going to happen. She's alone. She's having to deal with loss. And I can remember after the funeral, after the busyness is all over, her response was simply to get busy and to do practical things that she was good at doing. So she sorted out all my dad's clothes, and she cleaned the house from top to bottom. She just got busy. And I've got a feeling that was sort of something that was in the mind of these women today. They had to do something. They had to do something. One day, Jesus was alive. The next day, he'd gone. One day, all their great hopes, he was going to be crowned king. He was going to be the Messiah. And next day, he's dead. And it's all gone. So they busy themselves. And they do something practical, and they do something useful. Jesus has died on a Friday afternoon. The Sabbath begins at sunset on the Friday and lasts right through to sunset on the Saturday. You're not allowed to do anything during those hours, those 24 hours of the Sabbath. So Jesus' burial was a very hurried affair. He was quickly put into the tomb, a stone rolled over it, and there was some ointment, some spices involved, but it was all a bit hurried. None of it had been done properly. So now, on the 3rd day, they set out for the tomb with a sense of purpose, because they had loved Jesus, they had followed Jesus, they had walked with Jesus, they had shared with him his vision of a better world, the world they longed for. But it had all come to nothing. So at the very least, all they could do is give him a decent burial. The woman took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. Okay, the next phrase that jumped out at me is in verse 8. Then they remembered his words. Then they remembered his words. When they got to the tomb, all their practical plans it all came to nothing, because there's no body. The body is gone. And instead they're spoken to by these 2 angelic beings who say this weird and wonderful words about the fact that why are you looking for the living among the dead among the living? He's not here, he's risen. And then the phrase, then they remembered his words. Then they remembered his words. What words are these? These are the words Jesus had said to them several times, over and over again, all the way from Galilee down to Jerusalem. We find a really good example of it in Luke chapter 18. Jesus took them aside, said, we're going up to Jerusalem, and everything that is written by the prophets about the Son of Man will be fulfilled. He will be turned over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, insult him, spit on him, flog him, and kill him. And on the 3rd day, he will rise again. Jesus had tried to get them to understand over and over again. Listen, at least 3 times in Luke's gospel, on 3 separate occasions, he said this to them. But we also know that at the time, none of his followers had taken his words seriously. For whatever reason, they'd either ignored his words or else just sort of humored him. Oh, yes, Jesus. It's like Jesus is going off in one. He sometimes goes into these moods where he says this weird stuff, and that's all very well, but we love him, and so we'll just humor him. I mean, we don't do that, do we? We don't do stuff like that. I mean, we don't just take the bits that Jesus says that we like and pay attention to them and ignore all the other stuff. We don't do that, do we? No, I can see that. No. We're all good followers of Jesus. You know all the stuff he says about, like, whoever wants to seek his life will save his life will lose it. But whoever is willing to lose their life for my sake will save it. And whoever wants to follow me must take up their cross and follow. We all take that perfectly seriously, don't we? And then there's all the other stuff about Jesus. You know, the miracles, the story of the resurrection, his talk about the Holy Spirit. There's always the temptation that we might take all that stuff with a pinch of salt, you know. And then one day, something will happen, and our eyes will be opened, and we will realize that it is all true. That's what happened to those women that day. And then they remembered his words. And then the next phrase, verse 11. Their words seemed to them like nonsense. The woman rushed back to tell the disciples that Jesus is risen, and their words seemed to them like nonsense. In other words, their words just did not make sense. People don't just die and then 3 days later come back to life again. It just doesn't happen. It doesn't make sense. Except, as any student of philosophy will tell you, just because something has never happened before doesn't mean to say it will never happen at all. And just because something doesn't make sense doesn't mean that it can't be true. I think we live our lives surrounded by things that don't actually make sense. And I'll give you a good example. It's the one it's my go-to example. Gravity. Gravity, you know, gravity works, and it can be measured. Try explaining it to me. Why does it happen? It doesn't make sense. And yet we live with it. The world is full of things that doesn't make sense. They don't make sense, but that doesn't mean to say they're not real. And that morning, those poor, bewildered disciples are having to undergo a major rethink of everything they thought was possible, everything that they thought made sense. You see, if Jesus has risen, it must mean that all the other things he is always banging on about, you know, things about his kingdom is not of this world, his kingdom is for all people, not just the Jews, that his kingdom is the place where victory is being won over evil and sin and death, that he will come again one day to judge the living and the dead according to how they've responded to the good news of his kingdom, that he will come again one day to make all things new. Jesus had been banging on about all these things. Now he's risen. Does that mean that he was actually speaking the truth? That all that is real? They're undergoing this major rethink of everything they thought is possible. So there's the third phrase. And then lastly, I'm struck by Peter's reaction to the news. Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Ran to the tomb. I mean, yes, he had to go there. He had to check out what the women were saying. Did he have to run? When was the last time you ran? I mean, I don't mean if we only run when we're wearing the uniform these days. We have the jogging suit, we have the lycra, we have all that sort of stuff. That means we can run, and no one will think we're weird. But just normally, without wearing all that running, when did you last run? Peter ran to the tomb. Why did he run to the tomb? I can just imagine him. You know, just imagine for yourself. It's the day after the Sabbath. It's Jerusalem. The streets are quiet. It's just after dawn. Suddenly a door bursts open, and a man runs out, and he runs past you down the street. And he runs all the way around the corner, all the way up the city walls. He runs through the city gates. The guards are just having their breakfast. Whoof! This man runs past them. What's that all about? He runs and runs and runs all the way to the tomb, and there he finds that it is true, that the tomb is empty. Why does he run? To me, it's a sense of urgency, it's a sense of desperation, and he runs because he's daring to hope that this is true. He is daring to hope that this is true. He just wants to get there to find out. Because as we know, he has spent the last 48 hours in a sort of limbo. He had promised, remember, he had promised to stand by Jesus. They may all run away, I will never leave you, he said. And of course, he runs away with the others. He had promised never to betray him. That I will speak up for you, I will defend you to the last. And then, of course, what happens? 3 times he says he doesn't even know him. And then Jesus had died. So he's full of remorse, he's full of regret. But he's got no chance to say he's sorry. No chance at all. Now he seems he might have a chance. Now he thinks he can make amends. And that's why he's running. And Easter, if you like, Easter means lots of things. But one of the most important things it means is it's a second chance for us all. It's a chance to deal with our past, all the things we regret, all the things we wish we hadn't done. We can deal with them because of Easter. And it's a chance to sort of step into God's world, to enter into this world where there is grace and there's forgiveness and there's the offer of new life and where all things are possible. Easter gives us all a second chance. And so we're just going to have a few moments in silence right now as we think about this. Because if Easter gives us a second chance, in silence, why don't you ask yourself, is that what I want for my life just now? Is that what I want for my life just now? And if you want that second chance, if that's what you want for your life just now, can I invite you to come forward and decorate the cross?